Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us at the 2020 International Online Theatre Festival hosted by the Theatre Times. We are absolutely thrilled that with the collaboration of Digital Theatre Plus, over the past 24 hours, we were able to screen Richard Twyman and English Touring Theatre's incredible production of Othello. So we have Richard here with us today in conversation with Abdul-Rehman Malik from the Yale School of Divinity, who is also a creative advisor on the production, in a conversation that will be led by Jerry Brotton, Professor of Renaissance Studies at Queen Mary, University of London. So without further ado, I'll pass on to you, Jerry, but thank you so much again, everyone, for tuning in, for listening, for watching, and certainly also for sending in your questions, which we'll be discussing here today. So thank you very much, and over to you, Jerry.
And thanks to everybody who's joining us. And this is a kind of wonderful three-way opportunity. ETT's Othello, I think a groundbreaking production from 2017, which, as we just hearing, was streamed yesterday. So I'm sure many of you have already seen it. And on Shakespeare's birthday, which I think is kind of rather appropriate in our current conditions. It is great for me even. I mean, I was to some extent involved in the production, but it's, I think, even better to be fortunate enough to have these two key members of it to talk about what happened back in 2017 and really from here onwards. I mean, the project has gone on for some time, so I'm just going to introduce them both, and then what I'd like to do is open up the discussion. I think we'll have a three-way discussion, and then I've also got some questions that came in earlier as well. So we'll start with Richard Twyman. Richard is Artistic Director of English Touring Theatre. He was appointed to that role in 2016 after working first at the RSC. He worked on 14 productions there, including he has Shakespeare Form. He worked on the acclaimed History Cycle. He directed the multi-award winning Henry IV Part 2. He also worked at the Royal Court, where he was Associate International Director. His direction of the touring Othello that we're going to be discussing, I think, has become really something of a landmark production and has led to an ongoing project, which he's calling the Othello Project, which is a multidisciplinary festival of artistic responses to the production. And we're going to be hearing a bit about that as well in a moment, as well as the production itself, which leads us on to the other part of this triumvirate. It's wonderful to have Abdul-Rehman Malik joining us. He's an award-winning journalist, an educator, and a cultural organizer. His work's taken him around the globe, and it's taken him now to Yale. He's currently lecturer and associate research scholar there at the Yale Divinity School. It's very important to have AR, we're just going to refer to him as AR, because that's what we all know him, because he was creative advisor to ETT's Othello that you've been watching, and he also co-curated the Othello project. And the interesting connection between him and Richard is that they first met at the Royal Court when they collaborated on a play about Kashmir. So I'm really just a fellow traveller. So I'm just going to be really drawing them into a conversation, and to also have Abdul-Rehman talking about his involvement more broadly as an advisor. But I think mainly, and I want to get the two of you talking, and I think first maybe a bit of a provocation, which is to Richard, and then AR, I'd be interested in how you respond to it from your own position. Richard, there's an interesting quote that you once said that Othello is one of the most potentially toxic plays out there. And I wonder if you could talk more about that. I mean, how do you approach the direction of a play like that once you've labelled it? So, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, it's a minefield as a piece, and I think you've got to go into it with your eyes open. When we came around to doing this production, which, actually began in 2016 at Shakespeare Tobacco Factory, so quite a long time ago now, it was the third kind of time I'd met the play. Actually, the first was studying it for A-level at school. The second time was an assistant director on a production at the Royal Shakespeare Company back in 2003-04. And then this was almost 12 years later. And in that intervening time, I'd seen the play quite a lot, but I hadn't gone back and read it. And each production that I'd seen, I suppose, to be honest, made me feel very uncomfortable. You could tell that the intentions of everyone involved in it was to look at the play as a way to, or on the whole, to sort of look at contemporary society really, and to expose some of that dark underbelly of racism and that Othello suffers, and that in no way was one suggesting that Othello was representative of anything, but that it was a sort of, it's very much Iago as a Venetian who is the one that is sort of turning him inside out, let's say. And but each of those productions sort of, I found, ended up reinforcing stereotypes potentially, reinforcing, they started off really bravely and then almost sort of coded into the fabric of the play, the productions, was that toxicity, I suppose. And you couldn't help but get away from the arc that Othello goes on through the play and what he ends up doing. And so to come to the play again, I mean, it's interesting actually. I mean, 4 years later now, reflecting on it, I don't think I could do it again. I have actually started to question whether a director like me and my background should do the play actually, which is maybe a whole other topic of conversation, because of that minefield. But I suppose I was very lucky in that the first person I spoke to once I read the play was Abdul-Rehman. And I said, listen, I've been reading the play again, and I've noticed, when we studied at school, we were told to write essays around some of the racist comments that are spoken about in the first half of the play by Iago, and to look at how that exposes racism in the Venetian society, and all those kind of typical essays that you're sort of taught to do. But they were very, very much based on sort of, as it were, a sort of racism of pigmentation. There wasn't much exploration of Othello's cultural, spiritual identity. And reading the play again, I sort of noticed that almost 60, 70 times, I haven't actually counted it, I should do, he's called the Moor. And in fact, of course, the title of the play is Othello, the Moor of Venice. And I was like, what is this Moor, and why have I never seen that ever explored in the production? Why is Othello's identity never been gone into? And I suppose I feel that weirdly most conversations around the play are around Iago in a British contemporary performance history as well. So anyway, so I sat down with AR and said, so this word Moor, I think it means that, I know the Moorish kingdom, I know that was a Muslim kingdom, I know what's it saying. And we had a long, in-depth discussion, which I'm sure you'll talk more about. And you also pointed me, you're very modest to say that you only partly involved, Jerry, but pointed me towards your book. And it was the mixture of the conversation with AR and what you sort of exposed in your book about this extraordinary history of Elizabethan England's relationship with the Islamic world, that started to make me feel like we were onto something. And then it was a case of drawing in the right collaborators. I mean, actually, the production that everyone saw last night is the second sort of incarnation in a way. So actually, some of the casting has changed. And so some of that original cast I went out and saw, it really was built around the Othello, who was this very, very brilliant young actor I'd worked with at the Royal Court. And very interestingly, originally came from a Nigerian background, but came from a kind of split religious household, part Christian, part Muslim, and his identity and name even had changed in his life. And so it was really building it with some of these key collaborators that then allowed us, I hope, in some way, with our eyes open and at every step of the process, to plot a path through it.
One of the questions that came in, which I received, was somebody asking about the nature of the collaborative process between you and Abdul-Rehman. So, AR, can I bring you in on also to talk about that process, but also I'm interested, with Richard saying now he might not be the person who thinks he might direct the play at this point in time, and I understand some of the politics that he's coming from there. But in terms of your context, you don't come out of that strongly theatrical tradition that I guess Richard and to some extent myself do. So, when you hear somebody talking about that it's this most potentially toxic of plays, how did you come to that? How did you think about the play in that way as you then started that process of collaboration with Richard?
Well, first of all, Jerry, it's so wonderful to see both of you in these times of lockdown, and your shining faces and presences. This is life-giving this morning as I speak to you from across the pond in New Haven, Connecticut, on the first day of Ramadan. So this is all good. It's better than coffee. There's I guess every superhero saga has an origin story, and in some ways, Jerry, I do want to say at the outset that your work plays actually a very deep role in my thinking, because you and I first met way back in 2004 when the Shakespeare's Globe did this audacious, I should say, and really risky season of programming on Shakespeare and Islam. And that was the first time I had come across Jerry Brotton's work. And you had written the Renaissance Bazaar, I remember, a little bit earlier, but in the lectures that you were giving and the advice that you were giving to the Globe, and we kind of intersected because you were bringing this incredible, historic, often hidden, it feels a little bit secret narrative of the intersection between this Elizabethan British Isles and the Islamic world. And that culminated, of course, in your book, which has been sort of a lifetime of exploration. But I think that, for me, planted the seeds as someone who was a theater teacher, but wasn't often engaged in theater other than in a consultancy capacity. And then meeting Richard around Gins of Eidgah and the royal court sort of began a friendship. And what I have always appreciated, Richard, about your work is the incredible sensitivity, actually, that you take, and this kind of humility you have with text and with writers and with content. And so when we started having that discussion of Othello, it felt entirely natural that we should be having that conversation, and that you would approach it in the way that you did. And I think it was, I maybe my memory is bad about this because it was like 4 years ago, which is hard to believe, but I immediately felt that in your asking the question, it was sort of unlocking feelings that I had had about the play for a long time. That at the heart of this, there was a narrative of religion, of conversion, of its intersection with global politics, imperialism, colonization, but also the slave trade, its emergence in its transatlantic form, of course, but also its emergence within the Mediterranean world and within the cultures of North Africa. And all of a sudden, just to kind of look at the idea of the Moor actually gave us a chance to find a way out of the toxicity. And in a way that for me became kind of the mission, that how do we navigate this? Why? It's because, and I've shared this with Richard before, Othello is the play that every time I read it, I want the ending to be different. And that's because I love Othello. I care for him. I want him to be the hero. I want him to do right as he does in the beginning. I want him as the victim of multiple enslavements to succeed, to not fall prey to human jealousies, to not be manipulated by circumstance. And yet, I think now in retrospect about W.E.B. Du Bois and the notion of double consciousness, and I think this is the character who embodies double consciousness, who's living these two incredibly disparate lives and is code switching constantly. And I think in those initial conversations, as we delved into text, one of the things that I think that came up very quickly was that nothing really needed to be changed. It wasn't that we were adapting this play. It was the lens that we had, and through Richard's absolutely brilliant vision and direction, the lens that we had to attach to the audience's eyes so that they would see the play radically differently than they may have seen it before. And it seemed that to bring a Muslim identity back into Othello's character and to give sharp relief to the idea of Moorishness and what that meant in its complexity at that time and for us now was the way in which to get into the heart of this. And I think the question, Richard, that you say that you wouldn't direct it again. I don't know. I think we're all deeply shaped by the current discourses. I think we're not only shaped by them, but we're born in them, isn't it? Around issues of appropriation, white supremacy, patriarchy, representation. How do those things happen? And yet at the same time, I think what was really powerful for me, really seeing behind the wizard's curtain on this production from its very inception, was the collaborative process that took place. It wasn't just about Richard as a director or a creative consultant, or even Abraham, our first Othello. There was a really interesting process by which the entire cast kind of acculturated and engaged, sometimes very reluctantly. Is that all right to say, Richard? I think sometimes very reluctantly. and I think sometimes even sort of militating against this interpretation. But I think we got them there in the end, because it became so clear as Abraham kind of began to embody Othello and become Othello, and started reading the literature, which, Jerry, like the writings of Hassan al-Wazan, Leo Africanus, which almost tells that Othello-like story, that fantastic story of Africa and the Mediterranean and slavery and Christianity and Islam and conversion. All of that started to come together. So it was like we were being fed by all these streams, including the politics of the moment. It was before the 2016 presidential election, just after Brexit. I think that was also the mood music against this was taking place. That's a very long-winded answer to your very straightforward question, Jerry.
No, but can we, I guess we're going to ask, I think the next area is to talk about this notion of the identity of the Moor as we move into the play. But just before we move on, I just wonder if you've raised this issue, which is very kind of you to say about the book, and this is not just special pleading, but just so that people know what we're talking about. So I wrote a book in 2016, which was called This Orient Isle, Elizabethan England and the Islamic World, which culminated in a reading of Othello, which said there is a very long, complex relationship between the Tudor world and the Islamic world in particularly the 16th century, which has generally been occluded from both the literature and the history of that period. So that was one of the things that Richard then asked me to come in on and work in this collaborative way. But Richard, or maybe AR as well, could you just say a little bit more practically? I think it might be interesting for people to know. What were you doing there? How does that process of creative advising work as a collaboration? Or maybe Richard, you could come in on this to sort of say, what are you doing? Are you sitting there with the text? What are you drawing together as we then move on to sort of talk about how that works in the performance and how it was then put together? What are you doing in that moment, as you said, AR, about you peek behind the curtain and that wizardry? What is that collaboration that you're both working at? Is it the text? What are you working outwards from? What is the nature of those conversations that you're both having? Richard?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is it is the text. It absolutely is, like with a fine-tooth comb, going through every phrase and every reference and having long conversations. And it's also, I suppose, the world around us. It's long conversation about the contemporary world, and also the other artists that were involved. So conversations with Abraham and drawing on his own personal experience. And it's sort of putting all those elements together in a big blender and working out what this production at this point in time means. I think the great freedom of directing Shakespeare is it's you can't break it. There's nothing you can do to it that's going to mean it's never performed again. There will be another production right around the corner. So actually, it really becomes the duty, I think, of those people working on it in that moment to put themselves, their experiences, their life force, all of that into the making in that room and use that. So, I mean, very tangibly, it came from, it's really interesting where ideas come from. So, for example, at the beginning of our version, we stage a kind of off-stage scene, the wedding, as it were, between Othello and Desdemona. And the genesis of an idea like that comes from several places. I mean, sometimes it was the dramaturgical thing, which is that the play as it is starts with Iago and Rodrigo having a conversation that an audience aren't privy to because it starts halfway through. And then actually very quickly the topic of that conversation changes. So it takes in the text about 10 minutes before an audience actually know what it is they're discussing. Mm. And we had a principle in the room that Othello's on the syllabus very simply. A huge number of young people would be coming, and we didn't want anyone to feel, people have barriers to Shakespeare a lot now. It can be really difficult. We don't want anyone to feel that they were stupid and they weren't getting stuff. So partly there was a dramaturgical impetus for staging that. But also there was then in conversations about how do we flesh out both the role of Othello and also how do we invest in the love between Othello and Desdemona. One of the other weird quirks of Othello as a play, there are various things that seem to happen. And one of them is that in most of the productions I've seen, the love between Othello and Desdemona just doesn't quite ring true. Mm. And sometimes that not, although not always, there's a big age gap between them, and that's sometimes one of the issues. But more there's something else, and I think actually they get very little stage time where things are going well. And a lot of that stuff is off stage. So there became this sort of need for us to spend more time with Othello, to have him be the person that spoke first in the play, who literally wanted to put his words and his lens first, wanting to invest more in their relationship. And then at that point in those conversations, then going to AR and say, so what would and could this wedding be, and what are the principles of this wedding? And you might want to take over now, I don't know.
That wedding scene, that wedding scene is, I have to say, one of the proudest moments of my life as in any kind of cultural producer hat that I have on. I always get, whenever I watch it, whether it was live or even now, I've shared it with students. So we've had students here at Yale watch it and study it as part of a class that I've helped teach over the last 2 years. That wedding scene is to me, that's the lens. It's that vital moment where all of these issues around Moorishness, Muslim identity, love, enslavement, the shadow of Du Bois in the corner around double consciousness, it all comes to the fore. And there's so many subtle, beautiful things about that scene. The fact that Desdemona continues to wear the cross and yet participates in what is clearly a Muslim marriage service, that Othello has this incredible tenderness around ritual, and clearly this is something that they've planned for and talked about. It's said in Arabic, which in itself is such a powerful pattern interrupt for an audience, isn't it? That those who are expecting us to go into Shakespeare's language now get that slightly offstage counterfactual view of once again behind the wizard's curtain and the world behind of Venice. And that and it's so interesting because if I can share that I think when the students here at Yale, both graduate students and undergraduate students who are studying Shakespeare sometimes throughout their educational lives at the school have seen that scene, it's been quite astonishing, the reaction and how much it changes the way in which they study and view the rest of the play. I had one student say that they could never unsee that scene, and therefore they had to contend for about their hatred of Othello as a play, because that scene provided something that they could no longer hate the play. Wow. They no longer saw it as an entirely toxic play because they had never considered the possibility of other stories coming into this. It doesn't mean it doesn't remain problematic, but that's the in a way that's the creative manna of Othello, isn't it? That it's always going to be problematic, and it's in our addressing of the problematic that we're going to get great productions like this one.
Well, one of the questions that was sent in was about the use of Arabic in the production, and I think it leads us to now talk to both of you, or get your responses to that, as in terms of what you were just saying, AR, the way in which that's a challenge to the history of the play, but also to this vexed question about Moors and Moorishness. So we've been kicking this around. So could the two of you just sort of talk a little bit about this? I mean, I guess, even I can say, as somebody who works in the literary history of this notion, that we've always known that the play locates Othello as a Moor from Mauritania. So we have a specific geography that he's given. Now, I think what's tended to happen really since the time of criticism of the play from Coleridge is to therefore racialize that in terms of the notion of Othello as a sub-Saharan black man. Right? Now, historically, that just doesn't work with what we know about the materials that AR was talking about from the outset. That the Elizabethan materials are much more focused on the idea of the figure of the Moor as a figure who is Muslim. As much as he may be sort of racialized as a black man, he's a Muslim. So the way in which the two of you then started to use that in terms of developing a certain ethos around the play, can you just talk a little bit about this? Richard started by noting the use of this term Moor, but how the two of you then sort of took that forward. I mean, you've touched on it already a bit, AR. Richard, maybe do you want to have a response first?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things that's quite interesting about doing Shakespeare today is it's often being performed either by the people making it or potentially by the majority of the audience in a relatively secular context. And yet we know that religion is saturated through Shakespeare's work and of fundamental importance to it, both in the world he was living in day to day and just line by line. I mean, the references to God, heaven, etc. are throughout the play. So in some ways, what we found was by starting to explore his spiritual identity, and we didn't come into it making a decision. I mean, we the leaping off point was very much the conversations and your study of the material, Jerry, and then we sort of started actually imagining that he had quite genuinely converted to Christianity, as is suggested in the play. He talks about his conversion and all of that, and I suppose as we went through subsequent readings and subsequent conversations, we decided to push that further and further. And I suppose it came from this idea around both historically the conversion that was happening in the period, but then also this idea of the ultimate code switcher and how he has to assimilate and sort of subjugate aspects of his personality and identity to fit into a Venetian role. And I thought there was something quite articulate in that also relating to spirituality. So I suppose it was layered, but very much the first layer was what this lens allowed us to do, is just to notice the religion that's in the play. And I suppose also in a way that where religion isn't in the play, where Iago starts to say, actually, almost the religion he puts forward is one of a sort of contemporary Venetian, as it were, sort of religion, which is about actually there is no morality. Othello, you don't understand how people operate in this society. This is what's really going on. And I think what's so interesting is how Iago sort of is able to get Othello to buy into Iago's vision of a contemporary world that is almost amoral. And so, yeah, I mean, there's loads more specific things. We definitely, I don't know if cheeky is the right word, but there was something provocative about the extra step that we went, where we decided that in that, very famous Senate speech, that when he talks about conversion, we decided that was his way of sort of holding up his badge to the Venetian world to say, don't worry, I'm one of you, rather than something which was actually true to his identity. There was a part of him that he was keeping secret, and that part of him was his love, both spiritually and also his love for sort of Desdemona. Very cheekily, I often think about some of the changes we made to the text, and as A.R. said earlier, actually, there weren't many. In some ways, I still think the production is actually very conventional in many things in its staging and all kinds of stuff. And in some ways it needed to be, I think, for us to be precise and accurate with the ideas and the take that we were doing. But the one word we did change is really tricky, is we changed the yond to a yaw. And at the end of Act 3, Scene 3, it says now by yond heaven, and we changed it now by your heaven. Yeah. And that moment in our production where he gives up his love for God, which is in the text, where he says, I'm not going to have that love anymore for Desdemona, for God. I'm going to take that out of my heart. And it was a huge change, and a really provocative one, I think, in reality, but is one that sort of made real sense to us and our unpicking of Othello's journey.
AR, can you say something a bit more about that Moorish dimension?
Yeah, I think, you know, in a way, as someone who's a grown up Muslim in Canada, I've spent a lot of time in the United States, of course, lived in the UK, and consider myself very British, besides the accent and all that. You know, I think the idea of the Moor in my life has been kind of countercultural. To accept the idea of Moor was for me to connect myself to the fabled convivencia of Andalusia, of Granada. For me to be to identify myself with the Moor was actually kind of an act of resistance against Spanish, Catholic, Christian history of colonization, but also Moorishness as I've come to understand it, also was about the Inquisition and the emergence of the Morisco, the almost a nation of people living double consciousness and code switching for, you know, over a century and a half, of people who had been converted forcibly after the fall of Granada to Catholic Christianity, who lived a double life, who even developed their own language, a particular culture, a particular folk religious practice that tried to preserve something of what they were before. And I think that the play, and I mean, you can elucidate this much better than I can, certainly, Jerry, is that the play is coming at a time when in the Elizabethan court, the plans for the final solution for the Moriscos is being hatched. And it's known amongst European powers that we're approaching that moment in history where the expulsion of the Moriscos happens, and that expulsion is bloody and complete. And so I think for me, Moor contains all of that. It contains all of that history, great, good, bad, and ugly. And therefore, when I read that word in the play, all of those feelings and emotions and histories come back to me. And I think Richard, what Richard and all of us together were able to do was to bring out that complexity around the idea of who is the Moor and what does the Moor represent. I think the other, I mean, I put it in inverted commas, gift that we were given was that, you know, and there was a nervousness around this production, particularly in its addressing of religion, and particularly, let's be honest, its addressing of Muslimness and Islam in a somewhat positive way. You know, in this Venetian amorality, it is Othello's Islam and Desdemona's pure love that stand apart from the general wretchedness of imperial Venetian society. And you know, how would a contemporary secular theater critic respond to this? And then came the election of the 45th president of the United States and the Muslim ban, and all of the pounding of the drums around who belongs in our societies now. And in fact, when in office, we have someone who is almost Iago-esque in his amorality, and that we can see in Iago the MAGA hat wearing working class, marginalized by their own elite, trying to find someone to hold on to. Wow. Now it just sort of, the onion started peeling apart, didn't it, Richard? And all of these contemporary political realities started bearing in on the production. I think when it finally, came to the stage, it was all that stuff was in people's minds, and it just ended up being, and not to be too bold about it, and self-congratulatory, but let's be self-congratulatory. We caught the zeitgeist of the moment. Yeah. It was an Othello for that political moment. And I think that's why the response to it was so overwhelming and sometimes surprising. And why, when people who I know who might not go to the theater often came to see it, when I saw young Muslims active in their communities come out and see it or participate in elements of the work that we did around it, and then speak about it in ways that were like glowing. And how many times, Richard, did we hear a sixth form student, an A-level student tell us, I hated reading Othello in class, or I read Othello in class, I said that, and I said to myself, there has to be more to this story, and I was told that my teacher that there wasn't. Or I read Othello and I was scarred by it, for years. And this production has been a bomb, has been a release, has given me a different perspective, has given me a confidence that my story, the story of racialization, the story of being a Muslim in contemporary times, the story of being the odd person out, the story of not loving the right person, the story of not being loved back, the story of not being accepted is my story. And that story is shown in the production. That for me is that those were I think the most gratifying and powerful moments, certainly for me.
Richard, can we talk about that? Because, that's quite a powerful statement about how the play moves from a sort of certain engagement with historicity. We've been talking about the notion of the Moor, what the Moor represents. Because the other figure that we should, just mention, people who know the play well will know that, of course, there's always the language as well of turning Turk. So Othello is relentlessly, and Iago is using that language of turning Turk, which sounds like it's a sort of simplistic notion of Christians becoming Muslims, because it means so many different aspects of turning sides. It's also got a sexual dimension. I want to talk to you about gender in a moment. But then, as A.R. was just saying, you've then got race as becomes an issue when you think about a figure like Iago and his sort of social status. What is going on here? And with that contemporary moment, what did the production seem to capture within that, what A.R. was saying, a zeitgeist moment? Because it seems to me it has changed the dynamic around a certain way in which, I think what Richard was starting out by saying, there was a kind of post-war, anti-apartheid American civil rights moment where this play very understandably was co-opted around a really black and white notion of racial politics. And that was very commendable. I was, around when that work was going on in South Africa. That was kind of sensational. It was exciting. But the debate has now shifted. And I wonder if you could both talk about what that both means in terms of the production and more broadly, because the debate has been slightly shifted. And AR, we're also knowing that this is a post 9/11, post 7/7 story as well, that suddenly the play looks different within those contexts. It looks different again to what it looked like in the 60s and 70s. And Richard, I don't need to talk to you about theatre history, but I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that in terms of where it's resituated the play and what was the surprise for you around what happened there?
Yeah, I suppose what's interesting is that thinking that we started to conceive this in 2016, 17, is the world has actually changed so much since then already. And so in some ways, even though it's so recent, it's sort of just reminding ourselves that actually the conversation at that point, I think what a lot of people were trying to say about the play, and I should stress not everyone, that there were some really interesting productions that did look at the play in some interesting ways. But I was finding a lot of directors, a lot of actors almost being coerced to say this as well, that actually the play wasn't about race at all. It's something you'd hear a lot in rehearsal rooms or in interviews, and the play was about jealousy. The play's not about race. And I think that was one of the contexts that we were making this in. And so this production was explicitly saying, no, this play is about race. It's also about religion. It's also about spirituality. So it's absolutely about gender, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute. But that is a part of it. And I think that's what I mean about the play being toxic in a way. Is I think you have to be prepared to have that conversation if you're going to stage the play. So that was the first thing. The second thing, and this might sound a little bit flippant, but I was very conscious when we were making it in Bristol. Bristol's a really fascinating city in some ways, sort of on a contemporary lens. It's often thought of as one of the most sort of liberal and multicultural cities in the UK. On the flip side, obviously, it has this extraordinary history of slavery, which is pretty much, in the very fabric of that city, but which is very, very rarely talked about. And so I was very conscious that, a Bristol theatre audience coming to see this play would consider themselves to be very liberal. And where the sort of shock value of the play previously might have relied on simply a multicultural relationship being something that would put a sense of provocation into the theatre space, that was clearly not going to be the case in Bristol. That was something that I imagine vast, if not all, the audience had come to accept in 2016, 17. So there was also that thing of always trying to find the thread that connects you from the words that Shakespeare was writing and the world he was writing them in, and the world that we're making that play in, and to try and get some sense of how provocative, how radical he was being in his writing of this character, in his writing of Othello, and in the telling of this story, and in the relationship he was putting on stage, and all of that. And that need to try and tap into that and to provoke an audience in that way was really necessary. And I think the way that we sort of started to do this did that. As I was saying, the 21st century Western world, Britain's relationship with Islam is an exceptionally complicated, and you only have to see the press and all of that. It's something which, whether people are aware of or not, the majority of people hold, really complicated views on. And I think what this play does is tap into that subconsciously and start to expose those things. I think the play is almost like a warning in the way that it exposes prejudice and the effects of that prejudice if you let it fester and nurture in a society.
Yeah. And in terms of those notions of prejudice, I'd like to talk about gender, because you were saying that a lot of times in rehearsal there was a questioning about the role of race. I was in on some of those early rehearsals, and it quickly turned into a very interesting conversation, because particularly in the Tobacco Factory production, the Desdemona-Amelia dynamic was so important, was so brilliant, was so fascinating. And, both those women are destroyed. Bianca's destroyed. Interestingly, of course, with the Willow song scene, and people were asking about the dance choreography, and we'll come to that in a minute. But there's also the woman off stage, as it were, is destroyed, who's the Barbary maid, who's Barbary. And Toni Morrison's picked up on this brilliantly in a piece that she did. There's a sort of way in which it seems to me the production was also in an interesting moment, with Morrison talking about Desdemona and the relationship with the Barbary serving maid, who of course therefore is presumably a Muslim slave as well. So that's on the margin of the play, but can be brought much more into effect. To what extent, are we now looking at a play which also we might say is about toxic masculinity and is the destruction of three women on stage and more beyond that? Because certainly I know in my teaching of it now, that becomes something which is probably as contentious. It's the area that people want to really explore. And you think about our current moment of domestic violence and the way in which that now is so central to the play. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about that. And I think it's probably inspired by the Desdemona-Amelia dynamic, as I say, which I thought was so brilliant in the first production. AR?
It really was. I mean, and not only was it just perfect casting, but there was an intensity in the odd-stage relationship between those characters that became larger than almost the words that they were given. I felt like they occupied much more space. I think male predation and toxic masculinity were essential parts of the early conversation. And I think part of my own contending with Othello is to recognize that if he falls prey to anything, he falls prey to that thing which Iago and others have accepted, which is this kind of essential patriarchy which results in a misogyny. That at the very heart of it, there is a debasement of the female. And in a way that's also what's heartbreaking about it, is that Othello falls into that same slipstream, not because of his religion, but in spite of it. Not because of his morality or his blackness or his Moorishness, but because of his maleness. And it's interesting as well for me as someone who studies and immerses himself in kind of religious discourse, isn't that the thing about morality? It keeps us, it is the check on the worst excesses of the ego. It is that what in Islam we called the nafs al-lawama bisu in Arabic, which means that the ego, the part of our self which calls to that which is toxic and destructive. And yet isn't that the path that Othello is led down? That the Barbary song sequence, which I have to, which was interesting for me because there was a moment when the production had got sort of kind of moved ahead. I moved on to some other things. I was coming back into it as we were getting close to the premiere, and Richard said, I want you to see this sequence. I think you really like it. And it was magical. And that mixing of that incredible female energy, camaraderie, with the music of the Mediterranean and the Arabic language being so easy. That was the beautiful thing about it. It wasn't like, it wasn't that moment where we're going to do something in Arabic. Isn't that twee or cute? It really felt like this was part of their cultural milieu. And isn't that the case? You know, what we know about the history of cosmopolitan Venice, they're in Cyprus, for God's sakes, fighting the Ottomans. Yeah. You know, the language of the Mediterranean isn't just Italian or English or Arabic, but it's a mix of all those things. I think by bringing that element in, also Desdemona knows the song.
Yeah.
What does that say now, being counterfactual?
Yeah.
What does that say about Desdemona's history?
Yeah.
All of a sudden she becomes, and Emilia as well, but Desdemona becomes, well, she wasn't just introduced to the stories of the famed Africa by Othello when he told those stories in her house. She had a Barbary maid, from whom she learned Arabic songs. Yeah. So there's something else going on here as well, isn't there? And I think there's a subtlety in that which I hope people catch. But that says something also about Desdemona, and her vision is not merely the vision of a closeted debutante like all the men want her to be, but actually a much greater character. And I love Bianca, and Richard, you cast Bianca so well. Yeah. I mean, just there's a brashness, a woman truly of the world, navigating the world, who understands her worth, but also understands her heart. And I think the way that it was played was really remarkable. And it was interesting in the class that I just finished teaching around Othello. The Bianca character came up from the students based on what they'd seen in the production. And they said that they never quite thought of her that way as they were reading it. But to see her portrayed that way made them kind of go back into the text, and then we did go back into the text and reread all of Bianca's parts and how she plays out. And I think Jerry, you're absolutely right. I think that given that there's only 3 female characters, I think they do occupy a space, and I think there's ways that maybe Richard, if it was done again, that we could push that even more. You know, how could we push those characters out even more into sharper relief?
Yeah, Richard. I mean, one of the questions was about the physicality of the production, and especially around the dance and that choreography. But I wonder if you could say a little bit, just sort of elaborate really on that
I mean,
dynamic.
I suppose on your previous question, I think it's a sort of equal and as important part of the play as everything else we've been talking about, and I think it's interesting as well in terms of how conversation has evolved even in the last few years. You know, again, it's those two aspects of the play are so key, and I think what's important to me is that they're very much part of a similar conversation. For me, what was key about this production is that the Othello that we see in the first half of the play, and his love for Desdemona and his religion in our sense, is turned and twisted and affected by forces outside of himself. And for me, that is a sort of textual thing, and you don't see signs of that in the first half. It is a language that he is given, whether it's from the patriarchal of Brabantio or whether it's from Iago. He is literally sort of taught to see by Brabantio. He's taught to see by Iago, and he has changed, I think, as a result. I've been possibly a bit overly critical of previous productions, but one of the things I noticed, and it's a very simple thing, was that as Othello becomes more violent, as he starts to believe that Desdemona has been unfaithful to him, and as he starts to sort of imagine what the consequences of that are, I was finding that the sort of physical language and visual language of productions was somehow subtly reinforcing an idea that was innate to him and innate to his culture. And I think that's what was so important is it was learned behaviour outside of it. So just one example is a lot of productions I've seen that in the bedroom scene, as it were, which we deliberately obviously didn't have a bed, was that he would be sort of almost dressed in his bedclothes, which was sort of, in different productions, have been sort of African, whatever that means, sort of generalized African in nature. And for us, we deliberately went the other way. You know, we had him in a DJ, a sort of, you know, a dressed suit, because for us, he'd become Western. He'd become Venetian in that sense. It's Iago's view of that world that he buys into. So that's one thing. And then, yeah, in terms of the casting of all those three roles, I mean, I think, to be honest, nowadays, when you do Shakespeare, you have to have a really good reason to not explore the gender of all the characters in a way that makes sense in the society we're living in. So the decision at heart to say, actually, we're only going to have those three female characters in the play, and we're not going to change the gender of other characters, and we're not even going to actually seed those characters into scenes, which often happens in productions as kind of, I don't know, I mean, it's sort of incredible to say, but historically it would be, you know, the secretary in the Senate or whatever it might be. It's sort of traditionally what they would, you know, Bianca's part would be expanded out or something. Yeah. And for us, it's like, no, those are the roles that they're going to play, and that's it. And it's a really, again, it's a really toxic, dangerous decision. You better be absolutely sure that when you're doing that, you're articulating something about the world and the patriarchy of the world that you're framing, and that you are giving as much detail and life to those characters, more in a way than anyone else, and as much stage time as possible, so that that story is articulate and vivid. And I suppose, sort of simply, that's what we were trying to do. You know, Amelia almost takes over the second half of the play and drives it, you know, almost right through to the end. She's the one who sees everything first. She's the one who speaks truth. Yeah. She's the one that holds everyone to account. And it's absolutely no mistake that, you know, one of the phrase she keeps repeating again, my husband, or that she's alone on stage as the last female with a voice in a room full of men. Yeah. These are really hard things to watch, hard things to articulate. They're painful, they're difficult, but for us it felt really important that story was shown really clearly. because as I say, it's those two forces. It's prejudice in all its forms, but it is the racism and it's the patriarchy together that makes what the tragedy of that play happen. And interestingly, those have been two of the strongest forces that are in our world today as well. You know, that they're the forces that keep rearing their heads too. So I think the play in that sense, I always talk about it being almost contemporary Shakespeare's plays. I think it's one of the most challenging, difficult, all those things, but also very, very contemporary in how it explores that.
And that's a good point to sort of really ask, as I guess we start to maybe pull things to a close in some ways, but where does this leave us with the play? Or I'd also like to ask about where the project continues from here. But to both of you, where has it now left us with the play? The play, of course, always moves on. It's endlessly mobile, as Richard, I guess, was indicating. But where does it sit with you now? How do you sort of reflect on the project? Where will it take us with Othello? And Richard may want to sort of talk a little bit about the extraordinary afterlife it had with the various touring projects. So to both of you, I mean, where has it left us? Where do we go from here as well as where has it left us? AR?
Well, I guess one of the important things for anyone who's watched or enjoyed this production to know is that the vision of the production very early on had with it things that would be taking place off stage and with audiences. And so that became this thing called the Othello Project, which became eventually 2 podcast series, a number of festival type events where poetry, music, cuisine, conversation, artistic responses, new plays were commissioned and seen and enjoyed. We had kind of bespoke video responses produced, including the brilliant one by Nader Nahdi of the Benny.Space platform on YouTube. And what was so interesting about that was that so many people wanted to and were enthusiastic about engaging. I remember that final night that we did the Othello project at Wilton's Music Hall. There was over 200 people, Richard, 250 people who came through that day, not only to see the play twice, but who's hung around in the bar to listen to poetry, to hear music, to have food that was inspired by, to watch videos, to sit in corners and have incredible conversations. And we were able to bring in voices from community, activists from the Somali community, from the African diaspora, to have someone like Munira Tanya Williams being almost like a poet and an artist in residence around the play, producing new work, and right now working with Richard on some incredible new work that I had a sneak peek, Richard, of last weekend. It's had an incredible life. And then as we spread out across the country, in schools, students engaging with people like Munira and others, engaging in poetry and engaging in the work of seeing and re-seeing the play. The Othello Project was what I think gave this production an incredible life in communities and in the places that it went. And I think part of where I feel, there's so much potential. This train could keep on moving for a while, and I know there's been lots of plotting and planning and scheming around this, and long may it continue. These issues are evergreen. And Richard, I don't know if you or Jerry came across this incredible production that happened last fall in New York called The American Moor. It actually had a workshop of sorts at the Shakespeare's Globe a few years back, but at the Cherry Street Theater in New York, Soho, it had its premiere last term, and David Castan, Professor David Castan, a mutual friend of ours and who I have the pleasure of teaching with, a masterful scholar of Shakespeare, and I and our families, we went to see it. And Richard, what was so interesting is that it's essentially a one-man play by an African-American actor. What's really, Kevin Cobb, what is really amazing about it is that it's a middle-aged African-American stage actor who's still hustling and struggling to get roles and the only other character in the play is an offstage, clearly white New York director. And he comes in and he's trying out for Othello. And as he tries out, there's moments where he steps aside and has these long monologues and conversations with the play. And I felt vindicated. I walked out of the play. It was moving. And he had tears at the end. It was very powerful. And I walked out and I said to David, I said, it's all there. All the things we talked about during our production, all the conversations and coffees that we had, it was all there. And it felt like a kind of a victory that of course, we're not the only people having these conversations. We're not the only people who are, but that those of us, and I'm going to say this in a slightly arrogant way, so the audience will have to excuse it. I think those of us who are willing to go farther with this play, and that door that you open, Richard, to looking at this play and going farther with it, will not arrive at the same conclusions, but will certainly begin to ask very similar questions. And those questions are evergreen. I don't think we're never gonna exhaust them. And so I certainly, my aspiration, my hope is that there's something there that we will see the fruits of this production for a long time.
Richard.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we talked a lot early on, didn't we, that this production, in a way, the main point of it was just to open a door, and that actually the really radical, the really exciting production was going to come sometime after this by those young people that would be inspired by it. And I think for me that's really true. I mean, what sort of slightly shocked me when we started to have these conversations and did our research is we didn't find another production in sort of contemporary British main stage theatrical history that had explored this in any way, that had ever really looked at the meaning of the word more in any serious sense. And so it's weird to feel like you're the first at something. This is in the UK. I know there have been productions in other parts of the world. This is just in the UK. But we were aware that we were only, I think, just starting, really scratching the surface of the conversation. And there will be some of those school children that came to see it, you know, in Tower Hamlets, whatever it might be, when we were at Wilton, or wherever it is in the world, who will be inspired by that, but will probably be really critical of how we approached it, and will be able to go much further and be much braver with stuff than I was ever able to be. And I'm really excited by that. In terms of the Othello project, for me, what was really key is that Othello is not the end of a conversation. If it is, it's a pretty bleak end, because what happens is what happens. As I said earlier, it's heartbreaking. It's that Othello succumbs in the way he does. That can't be the story we're telling. That can't be the story we're ending on. That's not helpful, I don't think. So for us, again, it was like a stepping off point to talk to, commission, engage artists, audiences, and a creative thinking around this production to start to challenge those notions and start to talk about and take some of the themes on. And what was exciting was how many practitioners responded to it in a deeply personal way. There are two moments I'd pick out from it, and as I said, it happened all over the country, actually. You know, when we toured the production, each city we went to responded in totally different ways. Some most extraordinary workshops, events, you know, happening in the community. But there were two moments that happened when we did it first off at Wilton's. And one is the afternoon that I was talking about, where Tanya Munira-Williams was doing some spoken word poetry, female black Muslim spoken word artist, and the audience, 200 people, crammed into the small bar, and she had us chanting, "We're beautiful and we know we are." And at that point, in steps a stag do of quite drunken 40 to 50-year-old men, white guys, who and I was watching this unfolding and going, "Oh no, this is going to be carnage." And at first they sort of were a bit leery and refused to be quiet, and then gradually one of them pat one on the shoulder, started saying, shh, and then another one did, and then they stayed there for the entire set at the back of the room, sort of, a bit happier, a bit worse for wear, but absolutely enthralled by what Tanya had created and what she was speaking about. It was an astonishing mix. The second one was a matinee that we did around that on that day, and because of all the events, it had brought in the most mixed audience I've ever seen for a Shakespeare. And Abraham, who was playing Othello at that point, came off stage, almost in tears. He said, "It's the first time I've played the role. At this point, we've been playing it for several months. We've done maybe 60 to 70 performances. So it's the first time where I felt there was an audience who really understood what I was going through, who had these experiences of prejudice, of being an outsider, of being forced to assimilate. And that experience for him was incredibly important, I think. And so we could only have got to that had we explored the play and with all these other artists and brought in new audiences. And I think if you're not doing that with Shakespeare, in a way, you're going to be missing something. So I don't know what's next. We've been very fortunate to take it around the world. It's played in the Middle East, which was astonishing. The gasp of when he breaks the prayer bead in the full call was utterly astonishing. We did a school show to 1,800 school children. It was like a rock concert. I've never seen actors sort of so adrenalized with all their life. We've taken it to China, which was astonishing in terms of its relationship with Islam and race. And yeah, the hope is we can go further. But I think for me, what's also really important is the relationships that we've made with artists. And the conversations that we started to have are feeding other aspects of our work. And, I run a company called English Touring Theatre. And for me, who sort of almost co-opted this production because, as I say, it began at Shakespeare Tobacco Factory. But for me, what's sort of really important is that the English bit of that company's name allows and has space for all of these conversations and all of these voices. And that's a sort of ongoing sort of struggle. So that's really important.
Yeah. We're needing to sort of, I think, wrap it up, but I should just say that if people are interested, as Richard was saying, there's a huge amount of material which is online through ETT, English Touring Theatre. I think the podcasts that AR led that were great are there. There's a huge amount of material if people do want to follow up on this and have a look at. And I just want to ask one final quick question, because there's a question that came in, so it seems appropriate to ask Richard this in our current virtual sort of performative world, which was, what was the actor's experience of filming?
That's interesting. Yeah, I think on the whole they really enjoyed it. I mean, it's quite a quick process. They don't get much rehearsal. I mean, they've done the show a lot, but in terms of how they're behaving with mics and all of that, so it throws up all kinds of things. But I think for some it was revelatory, because I don't know, that they're imagining a bigger audience. They're thinking, they understand that if they are not so precise on every single thought and truthful with their emotions, it will be picked up. And it's interesting going through the edit. There are moments you can see where people just lose that focus because they're not, in some ways, it's just a slightly different skill. And there are other moments when I was so immensely proud of this cast and the company, where the specificity of thought I thought was astonishing in moments. So yeah, I think they had a good time. I think they were very proud to be doing it and for it to having been seen. But in some ways, I think we film it over 2 shows, and then it's sort of edited together. And I think they wish they had a bit of a longer run, that they maybe could edit from 5 or 6 shows, so they got it perfect. I mean, there are things amazingly in this production, because theatre evolves and grows as it goes, that we didn't capture. Really important things, that either because we didn't have the right shot, or because the actors forgot to do it, so sometimes some really significant storytelling bits. And in a way, that for me is one of the joys of theatre, is we were layering and growing this production as we went. 3 years later, it was totally different from where we began.
Yeah. Hilarious. Well, The three of us have been captured now forever as well. So I think we should end it there. But it's just been a real pleasure to talk to Richard
Thank
Twyman
you.
and
Thank you very much.
Abdul-Rehman Malik joining us from the States. Thank you both. Happy
Thank
Ramadan.
you. Thank you, Jerry, and thank you to Theater Times for making this
Thank
for
you.
making this possible. And so good to be with you three, us three together again. It does feel like the Musketeers.
Yes.
And thanks everyone for watching. Great.
Yes.
Yes, this has been an absolutely thrilling discussion. And as you say, Jerry, the play itself is sort of endlessly mobile. And yet at the same time, this production raises so many questions which are clearly so relevant in this contemporary moment. And it's been absolutely a thrill to listen to you to discuss them today. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks to all.